Good afternoon and welcome to the next session of the Fit Finance sessions. Today we're going to talk about lifetime allowance, and we've lost our fellow comrade Tim this week, so it's just myself and Henry. Henry, why don't you kick us off and talk about, everyone talks about the lifetime allowance, which is the cap for how much you can have in pensions, but it's changed a lot over the years, and there's various protections. So why don't you just run down kind of what happened and what you could have done over time to sort of lock yourself in, so to speak.
I can, because this whole thing came up in the last budget actually, where Rishi said the lifetime allowance was now going to be frozen. So yeah. The lifetime allowance was initially arranged back at A-Day, which was 2006, so 15 years or so ago. And when it was initially brought out, it then grew in value quite swiftly. Actually, it started at 1 million, grew in value quite swiftly to 1.8 million. And as you say, what the deal was, this was the amount of money you could save in a pension. Before further tax charges were made, and the further tax charges, they remain the same. So if your pension exceeds this figure, the excess, if you take it as a lump sum, is taxed at 55%, or if your pension remains in drawdown, you just pay 25% tax charge. But obviously then you pay income tax on any money that you draw out of your pension further on down the line. When it got to 1.8 million, the government decided that was a little bit too generous, and so they started cutting it back, and it went from 1.8 to 1.5 million to 1.25 million, and then down to 1 million. And at each of those stages they brought out pension protection. And the first style that they brought out was fixed protection, and what fixed protection allowed you to do was to fix your lifetime allowance at 1.8 million. But the caveat was you couldn't save any more money into your pension. Beyond that, then a new fixed protection was brought in at 1.5 million, and again, you couldn't contribute any further, and then another one at 1.25 million. It was just picked up people whose pensions were approaching those values at those times. When the allowance was brought down all the way to 1 million, they also brought in a new protection. Actually, they brought in one when it came down to 1.5, called individual protection. And what individual protection allowed you to do was to continue paying into your pension, but your lifetime allowance was then the upper of what the lifetime allowance was at that date, or the value of your pension was at that date. So you could continue to contribute, but in the knowledge that you were going to be creating a future lifetime allowance charge for you. Those protections are still available. In fact, individual protection you can still take out. Not many people do now, because we're a few years down the line from when it was introduced back in 2016. It might start to come back into focus because, as I say, the pension allowance has dropped to 1 million, and now it's risen to, I always have to check because it's a very specific number, 1.0731 million pounds. So £1,073,100, and that's now been capped. And I think Rishi said it's going to be frozen now for at least the next 3 or 4 years, after which point it might start to rise with inflation again. To be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think when George Osborne got into power, he found it a nice, easy way to push through some austerity by cutting the allowances and getting a higher tax rate. I think there were some, it's a long time ago now, but there was also primary and enhanced protection, which were actually more generous, I think, than those two, and allowed you to either keep contributing, but there's different rules around them. But I think the ones we mostly see are the fixed and individual protection. And if you've got fixed protection, it's always worth taking out individual protection anyway, just in case you end up contributing and losing the fixed protection in the first place, which I have seen, particularly with, there was a lot of discrepancies, particularly with NHS schemes, where people thought they could stay in the scheme and keep contributing, and sometimes they were advised, yes, that was fine. And if you haven't had that rechecked, then often people have lost it. So by taking out both, you kind of you've got a backup to the fixed protection as well. So, yeah, that's always useful.
Yeah, no, certainly. When I used to do a lot of work with the NHS consultants, and it was a huge thing actually, getting the right protection in, because consultants at the time, a number of them were getting, like, their pension was getting up close to 1.8 million back in 2012. So yeah, it's a relatively complicated thing. It seems straightforward, but it's working out how do you value a pension, and for money purchase defined contribution schemes that are so prevalent now, it's relatively straightforward. It's just simply the value of your pension. But for defined benefit schemes, there's no lump of money there for you just to go, oh, right, that's how much it's worth. So it's a calculation that needs to be put together, which looks at 20 times the value of the annual payment of your pension plus the lump sum for any pensions taken after 2006, which will be most now, I presume. I don't imagine many people have left their DB pension rights for the last 14 years. So yeah. The other thing that I was going to touch on, Tom, what are your views on taking your tax-free lump sum and crystallizing it before you get to 75 against the benefits of keeping it until you're 75?
Yeah, and I think there's often a panic with clients when they're approaching those figures. They feel like there's a need to take action because there's a deadline, so to speak. But my view is actually you're better off only taking the action when you absolutely need to. If you're below the lifetime allowance, you're better off taking as little tax-free cash as you need, or always taking a mixture of tax-free cash and income, because then you can effectively get more tax-free cash over time. I think the main benefit for me is if you do get to the lifetime allowance, potentially taking a tax-free cash isn't a bad idea, because that leaves less in the rest of the pot to compound. So if there's only 750,000 growing as opposed to 1 million growing, then the growth in excess of the lifetime allowance is less. But it does bring money back into your estate for inheritance tax and potentially capital gains tax, because you probably can't get it all in an ISA straight away, particularly if you're taking 260k, something like that, and you haven't built up those allowances elsewhere. So yeah, there are some pros to doing it, and it depends on what your expenditure is, and there's always the risk they'll remove the tax-free lump sum, so you're kind of banking it now, but I always think that'll always be retrospectively, much like people with protected tax-free cash from years gone by have always been able to maintain that going forward. It's just if you change the contract for any reason. So yeah, I think there's pros and cons, and I think that's why it's important to get advice. I don't know what conversations you have with your clients.
Well, I think that similar. I think the one thing that's not known so much, certainly by my clients, is the fact that once they've crystallized, the growth in their pension is then reassessed again when they get to 75. So, a lucky 60-year-old who's reached 1.07 million and crystallizes everything at that point, when 15 years later, their pension is going to be reassessed, and the growth on it then will again attract a lifetime allowance charge. So it becomes an interesting question then of, if you're going to go now, how much income should you be trying to pull out, given that you're going to pay income tax on it, just to sort of get yourself out of a future lifetime allowance charge. And the reality is, I find with a lot of my clients, there's no straightforward answer, and it's linked to a multitude of different things, such as what income they need and who the money's going to go to in the end, and if they're going to be drawing that income out, where it's going to be going. Because as you say, you don't want to be creating CGT liabilities for yourself and bringing money into your estate to pay another 40% on if you don't need to. And of course, legislation changes all the time. Who knows whether or not the lifetime allowance might jump, or indeed get pulled back, or whether our income tax rates will go up or go down, or
Yeah, and I think that's why it's always, if you, unless there's a specific reason to, you're better off just rolling with the status quo and then adapting as things go. You can always play Captain Hindsight and go, well, oh, they changed this and I should have done this at the time. But you've got to play in the here and now, because no one can predict the future, whether that's investment or tax wise. So I think, yeah, there are times when if it's 6 and 2 3s, it makes no difference either way. Then sometimes putting your flag in the sand now is a good idea. But equally, if there's no real gain to be made, then sometimes just staying still. And it's situational. If you're going to be spending that money, it doesn't. For example, it doesn't matter too much if you're going to spend all the tax-free cash over the next 5 years of your retirement, then the inheritance tax problem goes away anyway. But it's just, yeah, getting sound advice about what to do and what's relevant to you. There's no right or wrong. I think it's just having something you feel comfortable with at the end of the day.
Yeah, quite right.
Good. Well, that's another interesting episode, as some would call it. If you have any specific questions on the lifetime allowance, if you're worried you might have lost it, then please get in contact with us. It's relatively simple for us to perhaps go back and get individual protection for you. And I've often seen with clients, we've been able to save them significant sums just by filling out a piece of paper, just because it's never been thought about before. And I think if you're in these public sector schemes, it's not always been your bag financially. If you work in the teachers pension scheme or in the NHS, then yeah, just run it past us. And yeah, if we can save you 50, 100 grand just by filling out a piece of paper, then generally people are quite happy with that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Until next time.
Goodbye.